thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk. We've known each other for a long time, but I was just hoping that you could start by introducing yourself to my readers who may not be as familiar with you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jackie Norris. I'm running for U.S. Senate. I'm a former teacher and school board member. I'm the chair of the Des Moines School Board. I also have operated a small business, women-owned small business, which is where I currently am standing right now, called Horizon Group. And I've had the honor of serving Michelle Obama in the White House as chief of staff, and also equally the honor of serving as a leader at Points of Light and the Corporate Institute, which is through the George H.W. Bush family.
Do you plan to keep working at this job? I know you're going to continue to serve on the school board, but are you going to be campaigning full time or also still doing other work?
Yeah, well, can't working moms do it all? So, look, I'm scaling back significantly in my small business. I do employ people, and that kind of stresses me out, right? Obviously, the pressure of having people employed and making sure that you can make payroll. But I'll scale back dramatically, and yet will still exist for a while and support the clients because we work with a lot of nonprofits and a lot of regional visioning, really important community work that should move forward, regardless of me.
Can you talk a little bit about the top issues for you and what motivated you to run for Senate this year?
Yeah. So, I'm kids are in my heart. Anybody who knows me knows that, for decades, I've always felt really strongly about advocating for kids and by extension, their families. So, when you see hungry kids and recognize it's harder for them to get food, or you think about kids in rural Iowa and how hard it is now for them to get special education supports or for them to get access to health care, or even, a mom who needs prenatal visits and or regular wellness checks and has to drive further. All of those things for me are impacting the health and well-being of Iowa families. So, the fact that we pay our child care workers less than they deserve, and they have to work two jobs. And these are people who are taking care of our most vulnerable or our oldest. So that whole sense of we're not supporting kids and we're not supporting their families is really my why and what's at my core. I'd be remiss, Lori, if I didn't say I'm also a high school government teacher at heart. And when you look at what's happening in this country, when you think about the Constitution, when you think about checks and balances and all of these things that I know all of the high school students that I've taught know, this is not okay. And I think it's really important to continue to elevate why we need to address that because the institution is at stake in Washington.
Speaking of the work of Congress, one of the big fault lines among Democrats this year has been how to approach these budget votes. There was a big controversy in mid-March over that continuing spending bill where most of the Democrats voted against it, and then a smaller group of senators voted for it to avoid a government shutdown. And we could be headed for another one of those cliffhangers. So, how would you approach a vote like that? I mean, do you think that it's more important to avoid a government shutdown at all costs, or would there be circumstances where you might entertain going to the mat, even if it could result in a government shutdown?
Yeah, it's a really great question. As a matter of kind of fact, I don't do hypotheticals, right? I wasn't there. I don't have all the details.
Mhm.
What I think is interesting on this is you never want to stop the functioning of government, if at all possible, because those have ripple effects, direct ripple effects on the people who receive services. And so oftentimes I think it's important to look at this through the lens of both how is it going to impact Iowans in that 3 day, 4 day month, because that means money is not going to come to Iowans for some period of time. And at the same time, I also think that this tactic seems to be shutting down government, seems to have been weaponized between the executive branch and the legislative branch. And so, equally as important is understanding the power that would be ceded to the executive branch by making that decision. Long way of saying it's complex, right? Some of these decisions are pretty nuanced.
You're the fourth Democrat to announce. We may have more than four in the primary. What do you see as the key differences between you and the other candidates? And what would you say to voters who feel like, I like all of these candidates, and why should they
Yeah.
vote for you in the primary?
I think it's probably going to be up to six. And all I know is I'm the only woman right now. So, I'm going to bring my whole self to this campaign. And when I say that, that means I'm going to bring my hard work, I'm going to bring my listening skills, and I'm going to take a few risks and talk about things that I think are important to me as a working parent, as a working mom. I'm going to talk about what it feels like to be a military mom and worry about your kids and their future in the military, to be a small business owner and genuinely be stressed about making payroll. I've led two large nonprofits. And that's a lot of responsibility because at the end of the day, your job is to provide services. So in the case of Goodwill, services to individuals with disabilities, services to people that are reentering the criminal justice system. So I'm going to bring that. And I'm also going to bring my passion for working in a community. And I say that because in communities, when you're addressing problems, like I work with people every day, I have no idea what political party they are. I don't know if they're a Democrat or Republican, and we just address issues. And so that, to me, that idea that not everything is red and blue, like when I go to Rotary, I sit down next to whoever I sit down. I don't figure out what party they are. And I want to bring that thinking because that's the type of thinking it's going to take to bring to Washington.
I think you're one of very few statewide candidates who has also worked on statewide campaigns and even managed a statewide campaign. Of course, Iowa is very different now from the Iowa that voted for Barack Obama and that elected Tom Vilsack. But what lessons did you draw from being so involved in statewide campaigns, and how is that informing how you'll approach this race?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, I think the thing that I think is always really important to remember is that we can do hard things together, even when people think it's not possible. So, think back to a Tom Vilsack or think about a Barack Obama. The critical lessons for me are about showing up, listening, and good organizing. Look, good organizing means that you are actually, whether it's knocking on doors or talking to people face to face, people need to feel connected to the candidate, connected to the people who support the candidate. It's about trust. It's about relationship building. And so a huge focus for me is showing up, is listening. So you're going to see a lot of kind of smaller roundtables because that context matters. I think it makes good policy when you listen to people and let them talk about issues that are on their minds and how it impacts them. And then at the end of the day, it is really good organizing, and that means thinking, kind of 99 counties, but thinking by precinct. It's all of that type of thinking that we've got to do in partnership with our supporters.
My readers know I have a low-key obsession with what I call the mid-sized cities, what some people call the micropolitan areas, these communities
Yeah.
of populations between 10,000 and 30,000, that most of them used to be Democratic strongholds, and they're now voting more and more Republican. So the Fort Dodge, Atumwa, Newton, Burlington, this kind of place, Clinton, Mason City. What do you have theories about why we've seen this transition, and how can Democrats bring it back in those kind of communities?
Yeah. One of the things that's been really interesting for me is I've watched kind of this shift is again, who are we talking to and what are we talking about? And one of the things that I'm so passionate about is talking about the things that are me, right? So anybody who knows me knows that like they will have to run away from me because I always want to talk about education and young people and working parents and the burdens that are on a lot of people. That is not a political issue. That is not a red or blue issue. That is something that I think a lot of families are facing. I think talking about things that are truly what people are feeling and seeing and living every day is going to be important. Addressing affordability and talking about affordability and not just talking about like eggs, but actually like, okay, childcare affordability. How are we going to address this? This is an economic issue. I think the other thing that I will say is that I think that sometimes the Democratic Party, we've got some ideological purity tests, and I think it can come off as that we're not welcoming everybody if they don't completely embrace everything that Democrats stand for. And I think we have to be careful about that. I think anybody who's a Democrat has a core set of values, and yet the way they live out those values might look a little different. Look, as a mom of three boys, I've been spending a lot of time even learning more about our disengaged male youth and why that's happened and what it is that we should be talking about to bring them, welcome them more into the conversation, maybe in a way that they haven't felt.
We've seen in past elections in Iowa that whenever the Democratic nominee is someone from Des Moines, that the Republicans have a whole list of talking points about Des Moines versus
Yeah,
real Iowans or whatever that means. But how would you respond to that criticism that
yeah.
you can't relate to people in other parts of Iowa?
Yeah, both a little bit of what people don't know about me. My first teaching job was in Perry. I married into a family in Red Oak and Montgomery County. My kids and we camp, we hunt, we fish. And I've actually worked for organizations, and rural communities are part of it, right? So when I work with rural health clinics, they're in rural communities, right? And advocate and make sure that they have what they need at Goodwill, opening and closing stores, sadly, in some of our rural communities. That's those are jobs, right? There's faces on those human beings. So I would both remind people I have a set of experiences that is far beyond just living in Des Moines. The second thing I would say is I think we also have to remember that there are a lot of issues that we share in common. And, every rural community needs a strong public school. They need to make sure that they have access to services to support special education needs. They need to have affordable housing, and they need to have a public hospital, right? They have to have some of the same infrastructure components. And so that is not urban or rural. That is just for every rural community to be resilient, for an agricultural economy to exist. You have to have those core fundamentals. And I know a lot about those things.
As a parent who had two boys go all the way through Des Moines public schools, I was very happy with the education they got. But again, there is a perception that Republicans try to foment of big city schools failing and so on. How
Uh,
would you defend your role on the Des Moines School Board if they criticize whether it's for academic performance or COVID policies? And I know you joined the school board after the pandemic was well underway,
yeah.
but how would you respond to those kinds of criticisms?
Yeah, it's actually really sad that schools have gotten politicized in the way that they have. If you were to look at the state and you were to look at a heat map of where poverty is, poverty actually exists in every legislative district in this state. And if you were to look at volume, the urban centers just have more. And so we've got to stop this nonsense of this being a Des Moines public schools issue or a Cedar Rapids issue. It's actually a matter of kind of volume. We have amazing, wonderful human beings who walk through our doors every day. Let me tell you, these kids are going to be prepared to compete in a global marketplace. And yet, when kids need language supports or they need food supports or they need, other additional support, we have to provide it. And we should provide it because this is our future workforce. I will say that this is for anybody to label this as an urban issue actually does not understand what's happening in rural communities because there are kids with high needs that are in high poverty in rural communities and they need the same supports that we're providing and that we have to provide in Des Moines.
Is there anything I didn't ask you that you think would be important for my readers to know either about you or about your campaign?
Yeah, I'm really excited about this process. I think it's really important to show up. So I guess I want to invite people to invite me to things. I'm going to win the primary. I am laser focused on winning the primary, and I am going to connect with our state to talk about issues that are really focusing on kids and Iowa families. And those are not political issues. Those are needs that, we have to advocate for youth mental health, for affordability, and for childcare so we can have a strong economy. And we need to keep our young people here. So I think it's really important to talk about those things. So thank you for having me.
Oh, thanks so much for taking the time.
Great. Okay, thanks, Lori. See you
All
later.
right. Good luck.